Well, welcome to SCI-Arc. My name is Coy Howard. I'm on the faculty here. And I think this is the last lecture in the series this fall. Perhaps I should do it down here. Is this on? Should I do it all over again? I jotted down a few notes that I thought might be an appropriate introduction for Robert Irwin. And I tried it several times to try to get the right feel. So the one I like best begins, we all know about myths, magical creations and enchanted journeys. We all know about legends, the wondrous child, the protean father. And then I decided he'd kill me if I said that. So I thought I'd try something a little different. You can't do that to a friend, right? True friendship is extremely rare among men. It requires sincerity of concern, trust, faith, support, both emotional and intellectual, and compassion and respect for differences. And yes, in our particular case, a relishing of nuances. Bob Irwin has extended such a friendship to many people in the art world, and all of us are very much richer because of it. And fortunately, I'm happily among that number. There's an expression in the art world, first-class artist, third-class asshole. I'm here tonight to tell you that we're dealing with first class all the way. It's with sincerest thanks personally and with deepest and profoundest respect that I present Robert Irwin.
I've had the pleasure of working with Coy at great length and having a dialogue with him for the last, God, I don't know how many years now. But I can say without reservation that I've not met an architect with his intelligence and with his understanding of what I do and the games I play, which is helpful and rare in the sense that I think part of being an artist is that it's necessary to create your own myths and your own ideas about what it is you think you're doing and to try and ground them in a way that makes at least enough sense so that the work stands for something. Sometimes that's not easy. We live in a time in which our history is very complex, even radical. In fact, I think probably we live in, maybe every period likes to think that, but I think we live in a period in which we are the recipients of one of the most radical histories imaginable. That is, it's my view that art and all the other really critical disciplines, including architecture, have over the last 100 years literally turned their aesthetic and their concerns upside down to at least examine or feature some of those aspects of human consciousness that were not prominent or certainly were not the leading factors in our decision-making processes. The word art, subsequently, because of the complexity of this revolution, has become so marginal as a word that it's almost impossible to use it and mean anything. It's come to mean so many things that it doesn't mean anything anymore. I say I'm an artist. That conjures up a million assumptions on everybody's mind. The word has come, as it were, to refer to the art of banking, the art of cooking, the art of life. Every kind of activity at some level becomes an art form. I recently went to a symposium here in Los Angeles. It was intended to be a discussion of collaboration, and the collaboration was intended to be between artists and architects. There was a very distinguished group of architects there: Peter Eisenman, Frank Gehry, Cesar Pelli, so on and so forth, John Cobb. And one of the first questions I wanted to ask, because I really felt that it was an issue that needed to be addressed, is what is it we mean by that term? And on what grounds do we assume to collaborate? It seemed that everyone in the room had decided for themselves that they were all artists, which made it very confusing and rather difficult to pursue. So my first question was, if architects are artists, by the same reasoning, are artists architects? And it strikes me in thinking about it, no, they're not. And if they are, which as this conference turned out, everyone wanted to maintain the position they were artists, if that's true, then there was simply no reason for us to collaborate, because what is it we bring to this situation that's unique and, as it were, there for the collaboration? I'd like, I guess, maybe to try and talk a little bit about this radical history, and to try and maybe draw some, not definitions, but maybe some questions from this history as to what sort of fuels, or what are the concerns, or what are the issues of being an artist right now. I see the idea of being an artist as actually a discipline. And in that sense, then it must have, as I see it, some kind of a subject, some reason for being. And we build all these great monuments to art, museums and so on, so we make a big deal out of it, like it's somehow superior, and that's maybe the reason why a lot of architects would like to think they're artists, but that's, I think, is a confusion. I think architecture doesn't have to supplement itself with anything to justify its being. I think it's a discipline of great repute. And what's happened with this term is that it's become kind of an honorarium rather than a descriptive term. Whenever something is done well, or on a certain level, then we begin to think about it as being art, which maybe gives art too much credit. I would like to think that art services something a little bit more purposeful, a little bit more unique, and has a role in the world of some sorts or another, rather than just being attached to every other kind of activity or any other kind of activity when it seems to have raised itself to some certain kind of mythical level. I don't know if I can do that in one evening, but that's what I'd like to set out to do. The first thing I'm going to do is to just very briefly give you an example of this history, a rather brief one, all as it were developed by one man. You start out with the idea of a David, perfect perspective, with absolutely beautifully rendered, total pictorial reality. And over a period of 100 years, we dismantle that all the way to where we have to take somebody like Malevich with a white square and a white ground seriously. It strikes me something of consequence has taken place. Too many people from too many backgrounds living in too many parts of the world participated in this history for it to be some kind of a hoax or a joke of some kind. You don't take something apart so beautifully put together as pictorial reality unless there's some good reason to. I'd like to sort of play with what I sort of fantasize as being that reason. I'll give the lights and I'll do a few slides here. This is unusual for me. I almost never do slides. How do I do this now with the lights? Or do I? Light. Now, do I turn this thing on or off or what? Machine on. Hello? Oh, okay, fine. That's all I needed to know. The artist not in question, the artist I'd like to show, who I think probably walked us through that history in terms of his own personal investigations, more maybe clearer than any other one, is Piet Mondrian. In this particular case, I selected a series of slides which are almost of one subject. And so the evolution and the development is, I think, kind of clear, so it spells out. You start out with the fact that he was an incredible draftsman, and the ability to draw in a purely pictorial set of terms. Series of tree form pictures in which he takes this pictorial reality and begins to investigate it, and to begin to look at kind of the phenomena of the physics of phenomenal perception. It's not an abstract term. It has to do with that seeing is not just a literate process, connecting, as it were, signs together, but there is actually a physicality involved, and that the eye reads not only visually, but it actually reads tactily. And it deals with the physicality of forms, shapes, lines, surfaces, and what have you, just as well as it does with its pictorial properties. I feel like I'm Jeopardy and I'm not doing very well. I can't get in. By fully integrating the sense of touch with the sense of sight, a tactile read begins to supersede the traditional literate read. For example, there's a wall, and the wall is curved, and it is rough, and it is red. A cloud passes over, and the wall becomes, or appears to be flat, it appears to be smooth, and it appears to be violet. Now, in a kind of quantitative way, I can walk up to this wall, and I can walk along it, and reaffirm that it's curved, and I can reaffirm that it's rough by running my hands on it. But what do I do about violet? Is violet a figment of my imagination? Is it some kind of phenomena? Is it, in a sense, something that doesn't really exist? And if the cloud goes away, it becomes red again. Are you tempted to say it was red all along? And when a green truck passes and it changes colors again, what do you do then? The world of phenomena, as opposed to the world of quantitative information, is a realm of qualities. And these qualities are continuously and constantly shifting. And they require an individual perceiver to actually activate them and to keep them in play. Without that participation, they don't exist. They do not, in a sense, are not transferable, or in a sense not quantitatively put into forms which can be concretely passed on. They're unique in each set of circumstances, and they're unique to each individual, which from a Platonic point of view looks like total chaos. But looking at this Mondrian, as it begins to develop these. All right, I'll kind of boom out here. So one of the things, the point I'm making here is that change is the first principle of the phenomenal realm, that everything is dynamic and conditional, vis-a-vis the conceptualized realm of ideal forms, of transcendent and concrete. This all requires an entirely different perceptual stance. I mean, an actual different way of standing and looking at the world. The second principle is energy. And you see in these paintings where you begin to move away from the pictorial properties and begin to more and more develop the energy of these paintings. Okay. Is the second principle of the phenomenal. In the world of energy, in this world, 2 and 2 never makes less than 5, as opposed to 2 and 2 makes 4, and is a product of the static realm of signs. An amazing kind of development here that's going on over a fairly short period of time. One of the things that starts to happen here is the third principle. That is the idea of a positive space. In the phenomenal realm, there is no such thing as an empty or neutral or negative space. In the phenomenal realm, not just things have properties. We can now speak of space as an envelope, enfolding, imploding, expanding, encompassing, active. Concepts like open, extension, boundless, conditional, etc. now have to take on new kinds of meanings. But working this way, I remember the first time I ever saw Philip Guston. I had been an abstract expressionist for a good period of time, having never seen an abstract expressionist painting, living out here on the West Coast, sort of acting out my fantasies. And the first time one of those big shows came from New York, I remember walking through the LA County Museum at that time was down by the Coliseum, and it was a Museum of Natural History, and you had to go through where the dinosaurs were to get to the the art department. And on my way through, I saw my first 2 abstract expressionist paintings from about at least 50 to 100 feet away. One was a large James Brooks, big shapes, big black shape, a big red shape, a big green shape, painting about 14 feet by about 10 feet. Alongside of it was a small Philip Guston, about this big. Scrumbly little painting, kind of gray, pinks, pinky oranges, pinky kind of greens, but very, very, I don't know if you're familiar with those paintings that he did. very kind of close, very tightly knit paintings. What happened for me was, took me about 10 years to work out, and that was that the Philip Guston completely blew the James Brooks right off the wall. And I thought to myself, I was painting huge, heroic paintings at the time, lots of paint and so on and so forth. And I looked at those paintings, how could this happen? Because in terms of any quantitative measure, James Brooks had all the power. He had maximum hue change, maximum value change, maximum scale, I mean, it's huge scale, and Guston had none of those things. And what I realized, as I said a moment earlier, that in the Guston, 2 + 2 made 5. There was so much going on, so much exchange going on between those elements in that painting, how things touched each other, how things moved and pushed and as it were, acted in and on themselves, that you were not dealing with just the elements in the painting, but you were dealing with this phenomena on top of that. The James Brooks, basically, 2 and 2 equaled 4. Nothing more than what you saw was there. That idea mystified me, and as I said, I spent the next 10 years trying to figure out how to deal with that. You look at the physicality and the relationship of the lines in those areas. As I said earlier, no negative spaces. These are all positive spaces now acting in and on each other. The idea of negative space, in a sense, is a pictorial assumption. You start out with the idea we have a known subject, like my face, and the nose is here, and I can read from here on around to here, but I can't read past that point. But having identified it as a face, you supply the fact that the head is so deep. But when you move into an area in which the forms now are no longer reliant upon a literate read, or that one can associate in the things in the world, but have their own dimensions, their own physicality, then those negative spaces begin to have a function. And the function means to actually come up into the painting and act in defining the so-called spaces, spatial relationships between these. One of the things that's also happening in this flattening of the figuring ground is the fourth principle of phenomenal art, which is that order is no longer hierarchical. Why something happens in relation to something else is conditional and is actively resolved vis-a-vis, is actively resolved in the process of perceiving it. Let me go on to the next one here. More and more he's developing the relationships of the energies here and the relationships of those things which are actually existent in the painting. The world of determined relations here replaces composition. Order as a logical method of organization is succeeded by, again, this idea, this question of things in relationship in direct context. Another thing is going on, mass replaces shape here. Space is a product of the system, shape is a product of the system of signs. Mass is characterized by its physical properties, weight, volume, physicality. That is, every element on that surface no longer is understood in terms of its volume or the way it occupies the space by what it is, in a sense, related to or understood abstractly by relating it to something away from the painting, but in terms of actually the physicality of how it occupies that space. There's actually a dynamic there that I can sit in a chair, but you can't sit in the same chair at the same time. You look at most abstract expressionist paintings, and people made these great moves and gestures and that, but they didn't understand the physics of the painting. That is, a stroke of red would go across that would have a dimension of a foot or two thick visually, and they would put another shape which would intersect that in a way which was totally illogical. A classic example of that kind of thing in terms of spatial problems is Franz Kline. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but black paintings with great, just 3 or 4 black strokes going and kind of acting in and on each other, interacting with the ground. If you look at a Soulage, which was a painter who worked at the same time, a French artist, who did the same big black shapes, generally on a blue ground, if you looked at them from a literate point of view or looked at them in terms of style, they obviously looked like the same painting, except that the Franz Kline was involved with the issues that I'm trying to point out here, and the Soulage was still actually an 18th century painting. Pretty much still a figure-ground relationship. The black lines on a blue ground, and the interrelationship between them was a vacuum. one of the things that starts to happen in this realm, and something that artists have a hard time getting a handle on, because we all are caught up in the myths of looking at pictures as pictures also, and that is that in the realm of painting, it's true, this in a sense applies to the entire world, but it's more critical in the realm of painting. Space between or in relationships of objects, in a sense, is non-existent as it is in the world. For example, I'm here and the wall behind me is a fair distance behind me, but if you were to paint a painting of this, the wall and my shoulder would touch each other, where the difference between my head and my neck, or my neck and my shirt, would be a much closer relationship. If you start looking at a painting without changing the subject at all, or the elements within the painting, you can dramatically, in a sense, compound the complexity of that painting by how everything touches everything else. There are no neutrals in that sense. Everything automatically has to touch everything else. How it touches, why it touches, does it come together, in a sense, just gently, or do these things really lean or push, or in a sense, act on one another? This is one of the funny myths of looking at Mondrian, is that most of us have seen them in reproduction, and especially the later ones look very graphic, as if they're flat. But when you see the real paintings, you find out that there is very, very, very complex surfaces, and what happens at the edge, how each shape, in a sense, acts on each other, on the other shapes, is really critical to them. The myth of seeing them in photography has almost destroyed the whole meaning of what goes on in a Mondrian. Starts out with a flower, starts out with a pictorial element, and in a period of about 20 years, essentially turns his world upside down. I have to say one thing, is that no artist has ever tried to make an abstract painting. What actually has changed here is our concept of what constitutes real, what makes something what it is. And what he began to develop in this process of paintings here is a different idea about what constitutes something, what makes something what it is. If you think in the sense of just a figure, and you think of a person and she's, in a sense, an ideal form in the Platonic sense, she's a goddess, a transcendent, ideal woman. And then you think of this woman as someone real, someone who lives in your world, who acts in your life, who's flesh and blood. And then you think of the person you live with, and you think about the energy, you think about the personality, you think about the things that, in a sense, that person brings to the relationship, and you begin to, as it were, value this thing on a different level. I used to do a simple thing for students in which to make this point, and that was to take a steel roller, which weighed about 100 pounds, and a piece of very smooth paper, which I would pin at the back, and set them both off at a distance, at that classic distance when you're in class, where it sits up on the stand and you sit across the room. And I'd tell everybody to draw exactly what they see. So everyone drew exactly what they saw, and each drawing, the drawing of the two objects, would come out exactly alike. Because from across the room, from the pictorial position, they looked exactly the same. Both had a smooth surface, both in a sense was round, had the same kind of shading. Then I told everyone in the class that they had to walk across the room and pick up these two objects. One of these objects weighed 100 pounds, and the other object weighed a few ounces. Then I told everybody to go back across the room, and now tell me what you know. Tell me about this object. And add to it the dimension that you now know and understand about it. It's there, it's certainly real, and it's as much a part of what made that object what that object is as its surface or its outside, as it were, its skin. So if they went back and made a drawing, in one case of just a very thin light line, and the other one maybe filled it in solid black, from a pictorial point of view, it looks like some kind of abstraction. If you look at the object, well, it doesn't look like that. The point I'm making very simply is that the whole shift here is a shift in our idea about what makes something what it is. A whole idea about reality existing, not that it doesn't exist pictorially, but that it also exists on other levels. For architects and artists, this, in a sense, should play right into our understanding, into our aesthetics in a way. Because to some degree, we are conversant with these, if you want to call them tools, or these elements of our world. We can shut that off and put the light on for a second now. Oh, wait a second. I want to read two quotes here. These are both by Piet Mondrian. Non-figurative art brings to an end the ancient culture of art. The culture of particular form is approaching its end. The culture of determined relations has begun. This consequence brings us, in a future perhaps remote, towards the end of art as a thing separated from our surrounding environment, which is the actual plastic reality. But this end is at the same time a new beginning. Art will not only continue, but will realize itself more and more by the unification of architecture, sculpture, and painting. A new plastic reality will be created. Painting and sculpture will not manifest themselves as separate objects, nor as mural art, which destroys architecture itself, nor as applied art, but being purely constructive will aid the creation of a surrounding not merely utilitarian or rational, but also pure and complete in its beauty. Kind of interesting quotes made about 80 years ago now. What I'd like to try and do, if I can, I'm going to bring that back. I have a habit of wandering around, so this is going to, might get humorous sometimes. What I'd like to try and do is to just spell out for you the two basic, as I see it, the two basic cosmologies involved here. The two, as it were, different ways of looking at the world and different ways of, in a sense, defining or determining what we, as it were, call real or reality. Plato and Aristotle set in motion an idea about truth a long time ago, seeking a kind of transcendent truth, looking for an ideal form, looking for something that was concrete, looking in a sense for something that went beyond just the ordinary or just the day-to-day, something which underwrote the meaning or the property of things. I think that was a marvelous idea and a marvelous quest, and still think so. But at the same time, that idea set in motion a relationship to our own being, our own feelings, and our own perceptions, which created a problem for us, the age-old mind-body problem. That is that somehow in Plato's realm, Doxa, the idea of feelings, was suspect. It was just an opinion. Feelings, essentially, the problem with feelings is they're always changing, they're always moving, they're always shifting, they're always different. And so therefore they were not capable of real truth or transcendent truth, but simply always in a kind of realm of lesser kinds of meaning. That idea, and I won't go into that whole philosophic thing, as it were, is the basis of our, the great jewel of our civilization, which is science. Science being really, in a sense, no more or no less than the quality of its measures, its ability to measure in ways which have repeatability and predictability. And so we develop out of something like that certain concepts on which we structure our lives and structure our world. A good example of that is of that idea of a transcendent or a predictable kind of logic is to take a concept like time, which actually has no actuality. There's no such thing as time. When we talk about time, we actually talk about seeing the passage of events or seeing something change or watching, as it were, as something goes through a process of disintegration or of development or growth. And when we essentially attribute that to time. But there is no such thing as time. Time is a non-thing. It has no actual physical properties, or if you want, it has infinite physical properties. So when you take a concept to build a concept of time so as a way of thinking or as a way of organizing, as a kind of method to, as it were, inform ourselves, and we develop an idea of time like a watch, it's not insignificant. It's not something we do just on weekends or on Thursdays, but it becomes, as a way, a ground for how we actually organize or think about our lives or think about the world. It's a beautiful idea of time. An increment, a basic increment of second, which can be ticked off and continuously and repeatable and predictable, and can be used like Euclidean geometry as another concept on space, and we can lay it as a matrix over all kinds of events and learn a great deal from it. and we can begin to, as it were, develop, as I say, a certain understanding, a certain predictability, a certain repeatability. It's a beautiful idea. Without faulting that idea, I ask you in a sense, does that how you experience time? What does it feel like? What does time feel like? I mean, what actually goes on? Is time metered out in this kind of nice discrete increment? Or does it do something different when you experience it? Does it sometimes contract and speed up, and sometimes it slows down? Sometimes when you're bored, it seems like time almost doesn't move, it stands still. The idea, for example, of trying to build or make scientific decisions or determinations based on experiential time, as Plato pointed out, is crazy. You can't do it. Certain societies, for example, the basic increment of time is how long it takes to boil rice. How sophisticated can you get in terms of measuring things with that kind of an increment of time? On the other hand, reverse it around. Does it really make sense to allow this kind of time to govern our basic feelings or our decision-making process? Isn't there a contradiction of some kind here? And if I were, in a sense, to develop for you a different concept of time, and as it were, begin to act on that, would that be a lie? Would it be some kind of counterfeit, some kind of myth? The point I'm trying to make, obviously, is that these basic concepts about what we are and what we do, and I go back to my word art, the idea of art, it's a non-thing. There is no such thing as art. It's something essentially we've invented. We've invented it really as a way of examining, or as it were, looking into certain aspects of our being in the world. Something to do with aesthetics, something to do with perception, something to do with how we organize our minds, something with how we, in a sense, think about order and relation and beauty and space and that. But there's no such thing as art per se. It has no actual form. I mean, historically, we've come to think of it as being painting or drawing and working with a pencil and line. That was fine and dandy, but it's not necessarily true. If you look at the history of art, there are these number of arts, brilliant moments in art. And I could say to you that each of those arts, in a sense, represented a perfect crossover at a moment in time of the mediated culture, i.e. the culture up to that moment, and the potential of art as a pure subject. And each one of these periods resolved that to, in a sense, a quite beautiful degree. And so each of these arts is art, but none of them is art per se. What's happened is because we've come to these things historically, we've begun to think about them backwards. That is, we've begun to think about them as something, as it were, defined. We've begun to put the object has begun to replace the subject. So one of the first things you have to consider when you start thinking about art or architecture or any of these time and things like that is to consider what is the merit of that basic concept, and in what way does it actually inform us, and in what way does it actually give us the ability to resolve what it is we think makes sense in our world at any moment. Let me just go to the blackboard for a second. I won't be able to drag this with me, but I'll talk very loud. There's a piece of chalk there. Make this thing very brief, and just to back up to that. The idea of ideal form is really, in a sense, the process of empowering, giving power. And we develop a whole system of signs and symbols on the basis of this idea of power, which it has informed the society brilliantly. So it's not an argument against. I make that mark, and that mark in this case, we'll say right now, just has the simple power 1. And if I repeat the mark, no matter how many times I repeat this mark, once we act on it as a symbol or as a sign, it has the power 1 repeated as the power 1. We again have that consistency, repeatability, and predictability, so that we, as it were, can operate in consort with this element as a sign or a symbol of a power that we all have agreed upon. Another thing happens which is quite amazing in terms of our world. I make this mark, and in terms of all of us as artists, as architects, the first time we sit down in front of a piece of paper and put a mark on it, that mark immediately becomes positive, and the space around it becomes a negative space. It's amazing. Just that quick. Put that mark, that paper, that canvas, the thing becomes suddenly a negative. Amazing deep space. He's the reason I'm here. A deep space. Now, I think that's quite a magical thing. Think how conversant we've become with that. We can look at a movie screen, black and white or color, shapes jumping, moving all around the screen like that, we immediately can form it into a figure. We can not only make it into a series of figures, we can follow the actions and so on and so forth and project into them all kinds of meanings, what have you. We've become so good at this, we're so sophisticated, we can read maps, we can do all kinds of marvelous sort of gymnastics with this kind of logic. And it services us very well. It's a marvelous idea. If I take this mark, the key to this mark is it says power. And the power is, the first level of its meaning is that it is intended. That is, it's not just an accident. It's not just a mark, a scratch on the floor, a scratch on the board. I put it there. I, you, or I, the collective I. We make that mark. We intend that mark. That mark now has the meaning of that intention. We can compound that meaning, but it starts out in the basic sense that it's intended. So it becomes a positive in that sense. It becomes a content, it becomes a vessel, it becomes all those symbols and all those ideas that we, in a sense, attribute to the mark. If I raise the power of this mark, develop a relationship to a sign system, everyone here is able to immediately to see that as a T, as a part of an alphabet, and we can move that into a word, and we can move that word into a paragraph, into a sentence, and into a paragraph, and so on and so forth, and we can do what I'm doing here now, put these sounds together and follow the logic or the reasonable logic of what I'm saying. It's a very powerful idea. But to be able to do it, in a sense, to a great degree means to commit to do it. You can't just do it without, in a sense, making certain commitments. I mean, learning to read, learning to write, learning to know these signs is not something that is incidental or accidental. And if you spend your whole life doing it, sometimes you begin to think that that's in fact how things are. If you take that sign, let's just compound it, and we won't mess around. Let's just take it out, just give it real power. Now it, in a sense, represents a very powerful idea. It's an incredibly important concept in our lives, a very major, as it were, history, a very major set of ideas, a major set of feelings, emotions. So this sign now has become extremely powerful. Something that goes on in here also in terms of the spatial thing is that the more powerful it becomes, the more it becomes separated from its ground. The more it rises out of the ground, the more it, in a sense, becomes the focus of our attention, the focus of our meaning, and the more and more this simply becomes leftover space. So much so that when I walk down the street and operate from that system of signs, as I walk down the street, certain things come into focus. Certain things are important based on a structure of meaning, a structure of ideas. Certain things become meaningful, real, and other things go to the point of being completely invisible. You forget your keys, you come in, if your mind's preoccupied, you look for your keys, you can look right at them and not even see them. You've all done it. And it has to do with where and how we invest our minds. This is an investment of our minds, and it was a very important investment. But in so doing, it also made us very blind in a lot of ways. If you take this idea, one of the things that also happens here is I'm able to do this. And I'm able to do this, make this thing portable, move it from here to here. Two very important things in terms of art. One, painting, other, sculpture as object. The key to that is that this space in here now is confined in here. If I put a frame around it, goldly framed, three-dimensional, whole thing around it, it is still secondary because on a scale of meaning, this is the containment of meaning, this is the containment of purpose, this now is just a frame and incidental. So visually, it drops out. In a sense, falls away. You can even hang them on red velvet walls. You can do all kinds of things with them. And there's a whole structure that in a sense, implores you to deal with this thing as a moment. And that really works very well. And in fact, that ability to be selective is absolutely critical to how our intellect functions. It is a process of election and selection. But at the same time, if you look around you right now, just look out through your own two eyes. Do you see any frame? Does the world present itself to you in frames? Or is that some kind of phenomenon that we've invented, some idea we've invented? As useful and as interesting as it is, that's not how we look at the world. The world's not made up of frames. We don't frame things in. Although maybe when we're tourists, we walk around with cameras. Let's look at that and frame it in right away. Because in a sense, it's an addiction for us in many ways. This is an interesting thing, though. One thing, a couple of other things are taking place here. That as this power raises up, and when art was committed to the idea of great moments, great events, transcendent ideas, that was really powerful subjects, really meaningful subjects, that it stepped out of the realm of it's just physically being there. It moved into this transcendental realm. Then, in a way, you had this realm, this positive and a negative space, and you had the ability to create a beginning and an end. Also, you have deep space. That is, things which in a sense operates and developed actually hierarchically. Deep space in classical painting really is this idea of meaningful to meaningless, series of spirit pairs and support pairs and what have you in relationship to this meaning or this, as it were, intent here. And this deep space is really ultimately a hierarchy in which we have truth, the ability to posit truth, the classical idea of it. And once we know what truth is, then we also know what untrue is. We know what top is, we know what bottom is, we know what good is, we know what bad is. We have a mind and we have a body. And they become cast into the strange relationships in which the mind-body problem is such, in which mind is really the realm of ideas is superior and the realm of body is somehow inferior. It serves us in a lot of very interesting ways. Maybe the only way that I know of in the initial sense, although we can play some games later, well not tonight, of how we actually do think and how we actually do organize information. Not just singular ones, but sometimes with multiple hierarchies in relationship to each other. But briefly, how it works is simply this. This, in a sense, is the truth, or this is art. Put it in my realm. This is art, and I know what art is. I'm here, that's why I'm standing up here and all you schmucks are sitting up there. Why I'm doing all the talking and you're all doing all the listening, right? Which means I'm next to the deity, as it were. That is somewhere, I'm floating somewhere near the truth. I'm right in here. So it works very well that I can look at your meager, miserable offerings, come in here, and I'm able to judge them. I'm able to judge them in the light of my knowledge, in the light of what I know, because I know what art is. It's a very high classical idea of order. And I'm able to, as it were, raise you up and to teach you how to be an artist in the light of art as a defined idea. Now, actually, on one level, that really works and is not a negative. That is, there is a body of knowledge, which is essentially what I think what we mean when we talk about civilization. This whole collective body of incredible knowledge that human beings have put together. And one of the beauties of education and one of the practicalities of it is to be put on the cutting edge of that body of knowledge. And when you're on that edge, that is when you really are a master of that knowledge. And at its critical point, you're able to really function in a very beautiful way. So one aspect of education is in fact that. There is, of course, and we all know because we're already 100 years, 150, 200 years into this history, we already know that there's another way to educate altogether. Having much more to deal with individuals, much more to deal with potential, much more to deal with the fact that I don't know what art is, or I don't necessarily know what architecture is. I have a sense about it, we can have some discussions about it, we can push and pull on this thing, but I don't know what it is, but most particularly, I don't know what you're going to do with it in 50 years. So essentially part of the educational process might be preparing you for something that neither one of us knows the result of. Very different set of propositions there. Both are true. If you look at this history that I just showed you, this Mondrian history, one of the things you start seeing is, first of all, the reduction in he moves in at a certain point, but from the David on, first of all, is a reduction in the power of this mark. That is from the king of kings in a red robe, to a king in a red robe, to a burgermeister in a red coat, to a red piece of cloth, to a couple of apples sitting on the table. The reduction all the way down in terms of the meaning being in the content of the sign system itself. As this idea is reduced down, another thing began to happen, a phenomenon in it, which was that this space began to become more and more shallow. What you see in the Mondrian, when you look at those things, is a point where this space, figure and ground, they speak of the marriage of figure and ground. That is, at a point in time, these two become absolutely interrelated and interdependent. which in a sense in this world meant Mondrian that this so-called mark, which started out as a tree, and the physical spaces between it essentially equally were responsible for the determination of that relationship and of that space. More critically, socially speaking, conceptually speaking, is that as you flatten this hierarchy. And the distinction between top and bottom, good and bad, right and wrong, up and down, becomes real and not real, visible and invisible, becomes less and less and less. And from a classic point of view, this begins to look like anarchy. I mean, total chaos in a way. How do we make those distinctions? How do we make those judgments? How do we decide when something's good or something's not good? How do we, in a sense, play this game when we no longer have some kind of historical, structural device by which we're making those distinctions of determination? Raises some funny questions. If you look at the history of art during that period of time, this moment of America figuring out, certainly from a public point of view, it looked as if it was a nihilistic, antisocial, irrational kind of activity. And the artist was sort of cast in this role of boheme, acting out some kind of antithesis in a way. It is true to a great degree because essentially this idea completely occupied all of us. And it's an idea that we've come to over hundreds and hundreds of years. Layered and layered and layered and layered and layered. So that when I come to this idea conceptually and educated, I'm educated this thing. If I, in a sense, I'm at the core of or at the center of this whole body of knowledge, this whole set of ideas. And as long as everything's working, everything's going well, I can, in a sense, function in an expedient manner. If you think about how we talk about art, and you can apply this to other things if you want to, but when we think about art, when we talk about the renaissances in art, the great periods in art, we're always talking at the moment when the highest level of performance takes place. When the painting, in a sense, moves, or when the art moves to a point of kind of almost ethereal resolution as such. As we know how the mind works, though, there had to be a period in which we set in motion the question which underwrites that potential, that answer. The answer becoming the resolution to the question was set in motion. So in a way we could argue that the really great moments in a society, the really high moments, are the moments when we set in motion the question. That the quality of the question is equal, at least, to the qualities of the answer. But we have no way of measuring the quality of the question. Because in an objective sense, looking at it quantitatively, you cannot measure just the quality of the question. You only measure the quality of performance. I can look at this thing and measure. I have whole systems of measure to decide whether it's going to say. There's ways of weighing this thing. So I can say it's a good or bad idea, or it's a great idea, or it's a modern, it's an art, and so on and so on. So there, in a sense, one of the things we have to put in motion is the potential, the possibility that the question is equally active in the process. And we have the dialectic, maybe, of a question moving to an answer, the answer setting in motion another set of questions. So what happens in a way is that this dynamic, if that is not true, then this thing continually spins in on itself, expanding in a way, possibly in terms of knowledge, but constantly operating from the same principles or the same ground. Unless now and then there happens to be a problem. That is, in my performance on a day-to-day basis, I run into a question and I can't quite answer it. That doesn't seem to make sense to me. Now, it's not unreasonable for me to assume that I'm doing something wrong, that it's a lack of my knowledge, somehow I don't know what I'm doing, what have you. So I can kind of set this question aside over here. I just sort of set it over there. If, after a while, I look over there one day, and I got a few questions that can't be answered, I might, as one person in society, become concerned. This might become an issue for me. For everyone else, the world is still green, the grass still grows, and what have you, and we're going along, everything's functioning. But I've got this problem. I have a set of questions that I can no longer, as it were, resolve for myself. So I find it necessary to address these questions. First of all, I do the obvious thing, which is to essentially take them through all my systems, take them through all my methodologies, act them all the way through, and see if I haven't made a mistake somewhere. If they, in a sense, still continue to defy my ability to resolve them, I might have to question whether or not I'm going about it the right way. Now, that is the grounds for a radical history. The beauty of this is that it's all beautifully operative and moving in one direction. If I collect a set of questions which really, in a sense, raise doubt as to the grounds on which this one exists, because I've applied all the sophistication of this thinking to these questions, and I realize that I can't get there from here. Now that's what is known as an existential dilemma. I mean, people talk about it in relationship to the loss of God and everything, but it also can be in terms of the loss of the order of the universe or some concept of order. With this thing, this basic concept, I'm so far removed from the positing of this that I've got a real problem. If you look at the 19th century, not only just in art, but in philosophy, you think of Husserl, for example, when he talks about the idea of the necessity of a phenomenological reduction. What he's really saying is that the only way I'm going to be able to deal with the issues that I'm confronted with is to go back to the beginning. He set two things in motion. One, the phenomenological methodology, when the key to that was the idea of bracketing out, which is really critical here. In the classical sense, if I know what the truth is, how do I deal with contradiction? And the problem is not very well. The answer is not very well, or not at all. If I know what the truth is, what then is a contradiction? So if, in a sense, I'm really finally confronted with that kind of necessity to move from one transcendent truth to another, you're going to understand the complexity of it. What Husserl was saying is that there was nothing necessarily wrong with all of this, except when I applied it to this problem. That the ideas and the sophistication here were not in and of themselves wrong, but they were, in a sense, not able to deal with this. But the problem was, I am immersed in this. I am, in other words, to do these things, as I said, to read the system of science. I am that system of science. I am, in a sense, completely a part of that logic. So he started his work, what he said was bracketing out, not throwing these ideas away as if they're wrong or if there's something meaningless about them. Simply saying they're absolutely functional, but they're no longer useful in terms of what I am tending to find out, which is it possible that it may be another way or another level of reality or another level of knowing. So what he did was to go through a phenomenological reduction. If you look at the history of modern art, as I just pointed it out, it looks a hell of a lot like a phenomenological reduction to me. A very careful taking apart, piece by piece, of all the reasons and all the rhymes, all the parts that has essentially made up that logic. Very interesting, paraphrasing Malevich, at one point presented with that, everyone said, my God, everything we know and love is gone. I mean, all this thing is just a desert. And he said, we have arrived, into paraphrasing Malevich, in a place where where there is no more likeness of reality, no idealistic images, no more things, nothing but a bare bones desert. And then Malevich said, but here in this desert, we can now begin to question how it might be otherwise. We're in the world of pure feelings. Right or wrong, that's a very curious history. I find myself hooked by it. Having taken this all the way back to zero, in a sense, it can look to anybody who's still operative here as if, as I said, an irrational, antisocial, nihilistic activity. Because if I ask somebody halfway through this process, what are your alternatives? What are your truths? Doesn't have one. You have to understand that this history is not a constructive history at this point, but it was a process of deconstructing in a way, of withdrawing from a complete commitment to the logic to simply arrive at a ground. The ground being, in a sense, a place to begin. Classic example. I spent a little bit of time, one time or another, reading about perception, reading about the human mind, about how the mind works and that. And I find it very interesting, if you look at the English dictionary, which you all have, at the number of words for consciousness, which all mean the same thing. Consciousness, awareness, cognizance, all words speaking to the moment of seizing, the moment of taking hold, which means the cognitive moment. And And yet, with all the research that's been done on the human mind, we know that that's not the sum total of consciousness. What we have is we started out with the subject already defined as an object. That is, it's already captured by an assumption. The assumption that consciousness is, in the best sense, the moment of cognition. I take hold. But I can't do that if something hasn't already exceeded. I have to be conscious of something. The whole process of perception, I'm not going to go into that, the whole process of perception only works because I'm not cognitive of it. If I were cognitive of it, I wouldn't be able to move, I wouldn't be able to function. Kant sets out in a rather beautiful essay the basic parameters, the basic frames within which all consciousness occurs are temporal and spatial. And yet by any quantitative measure, consciousness doesn't exist. I lay in the bed, I'm laying in bed in the morning, I open my eyes, the world is instantly formed. The whole thing's there, complete, with nuance, and accounted for. Imagine what it would be like if it wasn't there. If you had to lay there for 30 seconds while it formed, all the pieces started coming together. Some interesting things happen. One is that you'd be aware that you actively form the world, that it's not just given, that you actually participate in the process of forming that world. The fact that it forms immediately is what allows me to get up and shave my face and brush my teeth and get on with my business. If I had to lay there for every second for everything to form, I would not be functional at all. The interesting thing why cognitive mind, why the whole cognitive argument cannot really take perception, fundamentally why I can't take it seriously, is because this takes place in no increment of time, not even a second passes. It is formed instantaneously, therefore it's invisible from a cognitive point of view. It has no increment, no quantitative increment that can be identified with. I won't go into the whole thing, but it can be made very clear that it only functions because we don't participate in it cognitively. So if I start out with the idea of thinking about consciousness from a position that it has something to do with cognition, that is really its moment, then I don't begin at the beginning. And even from a logical point of view, that's an illogical idea. The first thing I have to do is to start out by positing the subject as pure as X, that is, something unknown, in which there are these properties of consciousness that I know about, and I can talk about the relationships, and I can even talk about order, of sequence of events, and so on and so forth, and I can, as it were, hypothesize, or in a sense, about these relationships. But if I start out with consciousness already defined as, or already as a part of, as an object, then I can't really deal with the subject. So if we go back to my art thing again, we're at this moment when, in a sense, the question is, what do I mean by the term art? Because it is no longer necessarily tied up with this whole realm. But a couple of other rather amazing things have taken place. Let me just go through that word briefly. Let's take our mark now. And that mark we'll assume is just, we'll say it is even pure accident in a way. It no longer even has the power of being intended. Now, it's not something I did. If you look at this history of Mondrian I talked about, it even goes further. Artists have already gone to the point of dropping this piece of string, Duchamp, cutting the template wherever it fell. John Cage playing with games of chance. The idea of actually even questioning this whole idea of intention, per se, taking this meaning all the way down. And we'll say for a moment, just for speculation, let's just say that meaning now is zero. It has no meaning whatsoever. It is not a sign of anything. It's not a symbol of anything. It carries no powers beyond its just physicality. But what level does it exist? And what takes place when I, in a sense, try and deal with that? The first thing that happens in our positive-negative world is that the space here is no longer negative space. But in one sense, it never has been negative space. I mean, it's always been the blackboard's been right there. The paper was always there. That so-called negative space never was, in a sense, a hole or a vacuum. This object, this art object, which I made in my studio, and I invested with all kinds of meaning. I can pick this thing up, and I can take it all the way to New York, and I can set it down, and basically nothing of any consequence has changed. the object in a sense becomes sort of self-contained. It is the content of a meaning which is meaningful enough to transcend all this bullshit that just passed through the living world. Interesting idea. The whole idea of portability, the whole idea of the object is a defined, focused item. These are all, in a sense, parts of the strength of this. Actually put it into the real world, this is not a vacuum. It would fall to the floor. It would hit on that floor and things would splash. A series of events would take place that had nothing to do with that idealized vacuum. You go back like this vision, there's no frame in your vision, there is no vacuum in the world. Physics will tell you that now also, at least that's the myth that they're playing. Okay, so we have this mark. How do I know this mark and how do I understand this mark? It no longer is a sign or a symbol of anything, and what may be one of the most significant things that took place in so-called contemporary. When we did this, when this Malovich or when this Mondrian did this, there was a great hue and cry that all human concerns were lost. That as the figure disappeared, that it was no longer, it was nihilistic, it was no longer concerned with human beings and human context. In a way, one could argue just the opposite is true. The beauty of this mark is that it operates sans experience. Doesn't need an individual to keep it into play in that sense. It's a logic that exists outside of us. It's a system that one can use and apply, but in a sense, one repeated is always one. In this realm, not true. No matter how carefully I try and repeat this line, like the river running over the bed, it's never the same. It's always different. And the difference is not, as I said earlier, quantitative. The difference is qualitative. The physical properties of each of those lines is different, one from the other. Each moves through the space differently. Each has a different energy. Each has a different physicality. And I know that perceptually. I know that as a human being by participating in it. And it exists because I participate in it. And so the human action is actually making you a player in the determining of what is and what is not. And also in the end, beginning to, as it were, imply that you are actually a participant in making decisions or choice. That you don't just in the sense of have to attach yourself to a God image or a system of logic or a law, rule of thumb, or a law of nature, or so on and so forth, that we do in fact act on and in the world. We are essentially capable of choice. I would say that's forget about whether it's right or wrong, I would say that's a fairly human set of questions. So humanism, the figure was a sign in which we acted out human concerns. In this world, the human is actually you acting on and in this thing. Another thing happens. Try and put a frame around this world. It doesn't work. This simply is another positive. Having physical properties may be more or less interesting, but no more or less real. So we don't have real and unreal, meaningful and meaningless, or real and unreal. What you have here is a positive in relationship to positive, in relationship to positive. If I put a shadow around here, it becomes more fun in a way. In the perceptual realm, the shadow is a very critical item. I couldn't move through the world. My eye doesn't work without shadows. It doesn't work without those kind of contrasts. But in the quantitative realm, we've now come to something that actually has no existence. It doesn't weigh anything. You can't measure it. It doesn't have any of those kinds of properties at all. It's totally transient. It's Plato's worst nightmare. Total in the sense something other than. But in the world of perception, like with my violet wall, it in fact does exist, and it is real. In the terms of being an architect, in the terms of being an artist, what are the qualities of the space? What makes a space feel right? What makes a space really make sense? The golden mean, classic set of relations, they work. But on the other hand, is there another level? Are there other kinds of meanings? Are there other kinds of ways in which you determine the nature of a space, or the feel of a space, or the quality of a space? And is that of any value? I'll let you wrestle with that one. But here we have, in a sense now, a positive, and a positive, and a positive. So now you have two different cosmologies. One in which you have a positive and a negative, with the ability to define a beginning and an end. and another one in which we have a series of positives in constant relationship with no beginning and no end. They're both true. They both work. They both have properties that are, in a sense, complementary by their contradiction. The history of modern art, as far as I can tell, is essentially a positing of this as being a real factor, as well as this in terms of how we determine the nature of our world and our society and our consciousness as such. That's a pretty complex one. So I don't understand what people say, what people mean when they talk about postmodernism. We're talking about, these are two basic aspects of human beings that have been there all along. So as it were, raise this thing up, in a sense, which is all we've done. To simply raise it up for examination and make it important by attending it, bringing it into becoming a part of the dialogue, and therefore a part of the meaning structure, and therefore a part of how we organize our minds, i.e. our worlds and our realities. If you do that, you have these two realities in a way. Don't know how you can immediately now start talking about deconstructivism and postmodernism and that. I think it's going to be another 100 or 150 years before we're even going to know how to act on this set of principles. We just, as I said earlier, Mondrian really in some ways took us just down to point zero where we ask the question. We're only about 50 years into really beginning to think about what the implication of modernism really is. We're a long ways from having any idea about the importance of that and what kind of world it's really going to build. Instead of pissing it away in terms of a lot of weird stylistic variations, I would like to think that this maybe is of some consequence. I'm being a little pissy myself right there because looking at the art world around me right now, it gets a little discouraging sometimes. I think these are real issues. I think they're in a sense real questions. I think they're really an interesting challenge. How one deals with them, how well we sort them out, it's going to have a lot to do with what kind of world we're going to live in. I was going to show some slides of one project. Having said what I said right now, that would be presumptuous. So I'm going to stop. I'll take some questions. I will. I'm absolutely a basket case in trying to answer questions. Everything is so complicated to me that my answers become so long and so convoluted. But I do my best. So there are some, that's kind of a mouthful. I find it, the other thing why I stopped taking questions to some degree is because usually I never get it. I'm not sure why. Yeah. What are my steps?
What kind of work?
What kind of work I'm doing? Well, very briefly, I was a painter, and I painted for about 15 years. About the time I got fairly good at it, I did some paintings which slowly dismantled themselves. They actually, they kind of almost disappeared. And for a while, there were people who thought I'd become the white monk. Phrase for the Jews. And for a while, it looked like I was in kind of less is more, or some kind of quasi-Zen interaction, which I never figured out because I felt about as Zen as a pullback in Ohio State. And all the problem for me was a very straightforward set of issues, just sort of walking through step by step. But I came to a point where I really did not know where it was going to go. But I realized about the time I became a good painter, a reasonably good painter, that I no longer was a painter. That I could no longer confine my paintings. Paintings that disappeared at the edge. They became involved in the shadows around them. And I was confronted with a really tough question. That is, how do I deal with them? And how do the shadow's there, it's real, it's a nice idea and everything, but how do I actually account for that? When I realized I wasn't going to do it being a painter, but I didn't know where to go from there. So the only thing I got to do was to stop being a painter, which, as I said, I just got kind of good at. So I also got into the studio, which was very complicated for me as an artist because I like being in the studio. The studio is a great place. And spent a little time sort of just wandering around. I tried making a couple of objects which were
very ephemeral. Somehow none of that ever made sense. When I went through a reduction similar to Mondrian, not knowing it deep down, I did it all by myself, sort of my moment in time, sort of acted this whole thing out, not knowing that's what I was doing, just sort of asking myself questions about why I make something, what's real, what's not real. And first of all, I got this idea that energy was a tool as much as mass and physical thing. And so I tried for a while to play with light. I got this room, closed all the corners, painted it all white, borrowed a clock, every kind of light source. Played with the idea, just looking at the phenomena, property of the light. And then never could do a piece from it because I could never separate the phenomena, which is what I want, from all the physical trappings. I mean, I had all this junk and everything, and this great looking thing that would really do marvelous things, but here was this, all this physical stuff there. So it was a little bit like a magician who you see his hands, So I wasn't really sure how to get at that. Also, as I was going through this reduction, I never really wanted, I was never interested in the idea of less is more. It struck me that less is more only when less is the sum total of more. And what I was doing is reducing my problem. That is, I had these things, I had a lot of shit. I just, lots of stuff. At one point, one day I finally paid attention to them and realized that most of it didn't work. There were all kinds of things in the painting which were atmospheric, they were all swell and cozy, and everybody talked about me being a very colorist and I was warm, interesting. And they heaped all these ideas onto the work. I was doing the same thing, but when I really looked at them, this corner didn't work, there were all kinds of things in the painting that didn't work. So my reduction was in a sense of personal discipline. I decided that everything either works or it takes away by its presence. So I started trying to just throw out the things that didn't work and trying to really make the thing. The first thing I did is took big things and made little things so I could really control them. Then it became terribly mannered. And I became aware of how mannered I was and how, when I really controlled them, how superficial I was. So I started having to wrestle with that one. Started playing with this, and so anyway, very briefly I went through this reduction, not knowing that's where I was going to go. And I thought I was going to be a painter. The next thing I know, I'm not a painter. Having gone through this, where was I going? See, where I was. So I did that, and I always wanted all this richness. I mean, it was never about that kind of thing. What I did find was very interesting is that I could raise a line. I did these paintings with just two straight lines on them. And I got so I could raise the line, the thickness of the piece of paper. The canvas is 7 foot square, two straight orange brown with two orange lines on it. I could raise the line of the thickness. I was sitting across the room, raise the line of the thickness of paper, the entire structure of the painting. So for the first time I got aware of how extremely, exciting, so that's the word, the potential of our perception process. Having talked to Ed Wertz, I had him present this to him, he said, of course, the eye is activated with only 1 or 2 photons of light present. The nose is activated in some cases with only 1 molecule present. The ear actually is activated at the Brownian motion, which is the most sensitive motion ever recorded. So you start to think about that. This perceptual mechanism is extremely sophisticated. Now I'm sitting across the room, granted, the whole structure changed. What slides I deal with is better or worse. But now I got another whole system. How do I decide who puts the lines on? Where do the lines go? So obviously I had a lot of confusion there. Having gone through that process, though, I never really wanted to lose all things. I was only trying to work. At a certain point, you start trying to put all that back into my world. Only have some understanding of why it was there so that it really worked for me rather than against me. Okay? So, also I was confronted with this idea that there was no longer a frame around it and the object was no longer there. I started dealing with the whole end of the room around the painting, obviously. Then I started trying to deal with the whole room, and recently Coy and I, he helped me, we at falling water, which is a very interesting problem. Here we have this house. Whether you like it or not, it's a shrine. People make treks from Mecca to come to this house. Don't mess with the house. The other thing is it's in this area called Bear Run. It is beautiful. I mean, nature is incredible. Don't mess with nature. Which, by the way, is something I've been messing with a lot. But I've always kind of wondered why artists have had to avoid that. That's strange, isn't it? But anyway, we're concerned with beauty. We have to limit. One of the questions I raised one time, we're really interested in aesthetics. We're really interested in perception. We're really interested in things like beauty. And we think when we hold our dialogue to be equal of nature, that is going to only be brought into consideration on something we make. Or is it more really about how we organize and think about the world? Obviously, it's more about how we think. In order, that raises a big question. That put me out of business right there. Making objects, which is sort of where I'm at. So I'm looking at this situation. I have a project in the Alps where I've asked you to just simply look at the way one enters into a valley. I have a project in Chicago, right by the Tribune Building, and what I don't know where it is right now, but it was originally 3 towers, 55-foot towers, 1 stone, 1 cast iron, and 1 aluminum, kind of 30s modern aluminum sort of thing. I had a project, previous project in Chicago was all with electronics and digital sound. What I'm saying is that what's happened, which is very curious, once you take the idea of this conditional world that I thought that Mondrian projected, first of all, you can't isolate it. That exists in the real world. It is conditional. There are, as it were, a set of conditions one enters into it, participates with. Suddenly there are no tools I can't use. Potentially no tools I can't use. Because I went from a painting to refine down to like a dot. And then the next thing I know, there are no materials I can't use. Sound, light, steel, what have you, depending on what the situation. And there's no style. I mean, if I'm in the woods and it's very poetic, style might be very, very rubby, hands-on, touchy-feely. On the other hand, if I'm in the middle of Chicago, which is an extremely strong architectural setting, make on art. So my biggest question right now is, can you do that? I mean, it's hard enough for me just to paint a painting. I mean, it's like, at one point I'm at point zero, the next moment I'm standing on the edge of a precipice. I mean, my problem now is drowning. If everything's possible, what do I do? When I'm focusing on space or objects in space, actually, I'm not focusing on either one. What I mean by that is that when I go to a space, if I can, to the best of my ability, I try not to have any presupposition bias. First of all, I feel like I'm an architect. I'm in somebody else's backyard. So I start out in space, but I try getting a little better at it. Learning, slow set.
What kind of intervention is your art in that case?
Well, first of all,
is it always about perception?
Yes. First of all, I have no ambitions for other people's minds. I'm not trying to tell you how the world should be. I would like to hope, at best, if I could, in a sense, open it up just to a sense that you maybe see it a little more than you did the day before.
You want people to think about it.
No, I want people thinking is fine, but I want you first to participate. For example, I'm getting play with your questions at the same time. I once listened to a lecture by Joseph Beuys, which Robert was very impressed by. I was very impressed by him. He said one thing which I don't know, conversation we could stay with, but he talked about the idea of the politics of teaching and the idea of communication, that he linked them together. The idea was that when he spoke about the mind at a certain level, in the teaching thing, you had these people who could be formed, and there was this ability to form them, this new, what's a bizarre idea. The idea that you or any of us is, I'm not a Christian. I don't pass out leaflets on the corner. because I don't know what it is, but I do know that there's something very marvelous there and that human beings are capable of it. So if I could turn you on to that under your potential, that would be as close as I could have as an ambition. So one of the things, for example, is that myself and Jim Terrell and video cameras in the corner in Bruce now, both who I like very much, but the three of us could not leave a room empty the same. We have an entirely different idea about what the reality of that room is. For me, the room is not empty. It is filled. If you took that Mondrian, any one of those Mondrian, took all the elements in there and put them into a room, it would be no less complex, no more complex than what a room already is. The room is already filled with incredible. So there's no such, when people walk in and say it's an empty room, think about what's going on with the mental processes. There's no such thing. So the first thing, for example, that I would do is not set up any barriers between you and the possibility of that simple discovery. I would not take you and prepare you for a while, or have you take your shoes off, or read a book, or I would like to hopefully on occasion set up a situation in which you have that aha moment, that where you get that confidence, you say, wait a second, something's going on here. You wrestle with it, and at that moment I don't want to be around. Okay? Because I don't want to govern it. I'm not teaching. Yeah. Well, yeah, sure. It moves into it. Yeah. Think about it. I want you to put it through your whole process. I believe in the potential of human beings, and I do believe that human beings make choice, and I really do believe, this without going into it very length, but at one time I was doing all this reading on perception, which is, it's overwhelming. It's great. It's amazing. You can ground it. It's an infinite problem. There's no way essentially to ever really understand. But it's a marvelous thing to get involved in. And I was confronted at that time by a series of social activists who essentially scored me pretty good about having my head up my ass, playing with this whole thing about perception. So suddenly they're laying all these social activist sort of things on me. And so I decided it's time I informed myself. I sat down and read everything Marx and Engels wrote. And at one point, reading through this whole thing, I was amazed by a statement that he made. A very curious statement. The first time he makes a statement is in the German ideology. Marx and Engels in the first one. It's in the German ideology. And it's a statement that says, life determines consciousness. Consciousness does not determine life. Found spectacular. First of all, I took this huge problem I was dealing with, cut it right neatly in half. Made it only half a problem. Life determines consciousness. Consciousness does not determine life. Amazing. But his writing then goes on to beautifully develop the thesis that life determines consciousness. The first 3 chapters of Das Kapital talks about the state, the condition of the individual, the condition of the worker in the world, and then he proceeds to essentially develop a way of trying to deal with that. Okay? He talks about his historical materialism and the whole idea of dialectical materialism, which is all these forces of history acting on the individual. Which is why he can't deal with an artist, never could deal with an artist. Because we constantly use words like creating, we use, maybe these are just mythical words, we use words like individual, we use words like free, actually to make choice, free, in a sense. I don't know how those words have any meaning whatsoever if individuals don't make choice. If in fact consciousness does not, to some degree, determine life. To some degree, we do in fact change and alter our world. And if there's anything that we're involved in this room, it has to be somewhere related to this whole process of in some way determining the nature of our own world, our own being. Okay? I don't know if that answers any of your questions. It's not an argument for or against Marx. It's a nice example because it's so clearly defined there. What I would say, obviously, is that they're both true. That life, in fact, does determine consciousness. But I think consciousness does, in fact, determine life. Yeah.
Do you ever convince where without two-part question. Do you ever convince where without an issue or a question in mind?
No. Not anymore.
Maybe something can be identified as process in the work as opposed to the word. The process constitutes work or art for you.
Yeah, both, either or both. In the sense that when you talk about this world, the left there, it is essentially, that is really fundamentally the grounds of what we mean by process. The one on the right is really the ground for what we mean by system. The simplest sense of perception starts out and makes no value to it. It simply distinguishes between warm, cool, hot, cold, that sort of thing. One's not better than the other, and one's not better than cold. Very simple set of distinctions. These things have no value properties until we add a third element to the equation. That is, I want or need to do something. I want to go to the door. Simple thing, I want to go to the door. Now, certain things become critical to my need to get to the door, and certain things are no longer critical. I go through this process of sorting that out. It's a simple trial and error process. And after I've done it 50 or 100 times, let's say it takes me 200 moves to do it the first time. After I work at it, I process it for a while. And this is totally experiential. I'm doing bang, because I know nothing at this point. That's what I process. But I go through this and I process this thing, which is just direct, hands-on, interactive. After a while, let's say I get so that I can go to the door in 50 moves, which is an economy of what we call sophistication. Or I'm walking in everything, I'm black and blue all the time, I get to the door. As a human being, I might feel that I have gained something of some value, all right, this process, through this process, and I can give that thing of value to my son. So my son, I'm going to show you how to fish, but I'm not sure how to make it. I'm going to show you how to get to the door. And my son doesn't have to go through all the knocks and bangs that I want to get to the door. So I hand this thing down to him. But it still has the nature of a process. It still, in a sense, goes through it in kind of intimate way. And dialogue is a verbal dialogue, immediately family set relationship. But if I take this historically and I spend it out over 5 generations, and we've worked on it, my son and other people have worked on this problem from the door over a length of time, we can get to the point where we're sophisticated 25 moves. Talking about sophistication now, it's great. We can then propose to move it from process to system. And what we do there, of some great value, is that I can now lay out for you systematically how to get to the door, and I can spell out 25 moves. I can then assume to do what one does in school all the time, is to teach you 25 moves how to get to the door, which, by the way, works. And then you sophisticated, and it's 20 moves in 15, and we get to this point of really getting focused in it. What I pointed out up here is one day you're walking along, like everybody else, you go to the door, and you walk into the wall. You look around, everybody else is still walking through the door. You go back and you try it again. That's what's meant by an existential question. Okay. The fact is, everything in the world is working, everybody seems to be doing what they're doing, everything's sort of fine, but for some reason, you're walking into the wall. You can't get to the door. Alright? Then you have the necessity for a phenomenological reduction. You go back to the beginning, like the father in the very beginning, and ask yourself, first of all, here's this perception from another thing. We ask ourselves the value of going to the door. And if so, what, why, how, what the meaning, so on. And we then set it in motion, a new concept, which we process. Process is the intimate activity of actually participating directly. So when they can sort it out for sophisticated, we made this marvelous process system. One reason we're talking a lot about process right now is just about being honest. We had to go back to the beginning. We had to take the question and turn it especially for all of us in this room right now. To some degree or another, right now we're on the horns, whether it's been dealt with sophisticatedly or not. Both these histories are sort of operating here, you know. Or sometimes they're all kind of being thrown into a pot and seasoned, you know, it's like really is. And we don't quite know what all the difference are. One day you're getting rules and regulations, the next day you're saying, man, I want you to feel this thing. You know, it's like, sometimes it's a lot. We're in a situation which we're ultimately, I think, probably in the process of developing some kind of hierarchy between the two. Einsteinian physics did not negate Newtonian physics, but it did do one thing. It made us aware that there's no longer a whole world here. And that's exactly where we are right now. Which, by the way, it makes it understandable. It's a very striking and very difficult thing. It makes it understandable why right now art and architecture are going through a real kind of revisions. Without knowing what the values are and not wanting to take the responsibility of what they could or should be, we've had a tendency to go back and borrow from the past, looking for good old chestnuts and good old security.
I'm going to retire. Thanks.
I want to express my thanks to Robert for being our speaker, the last speaker of our series, and I think it was a brilliant exposition. I also want to congratulate the Fall 90 Lecture Series Committee, the graduates on that committee, because I think they worked very hard, and the fact that so many people have come out, I think testifies to their success in this. And that committee, if they'll just stand a minute, Jeremy Levine and Phil Rutherford both co-chaired that, and Amy Sims and Tom Holtzman, Bill Eveloff, Zachary, Bonita Welch, and any others I forgot. We had a large committee this time, and I think they did a great job. I really do. I want to thank them. Thanks also to Coy Howard for his designing of the poster. And have I forgotten anyone? Hope not. And also Margie Reeve, who helped us in the staff advisement for the committee. I do want to announce two things. Though this is the final of the series Cultural Interventions, we have one more lecture we're going to give you in concert with 3 other schools, Art Center, College of Design, USC, School of Architecture, UCLA Graduate School, and SCI-Arc, and it will be held, the event will be held at